Have you ever had to play peacekeeper in your household?
At our family barbecue, the smell of hickory smoke clung to the air like a curtain, and the laughter rolled across the yard in waves that seemed to wash over me without ever touching me. My father raised his glass high, his voice booming with the authority of a man who believed his words carried weight in every corner of the world, and he announced that Rachel, my sister, had just been recognized at her firm for closing what he called a once-in-a-lifetime deal. He went on about her brilliance, her determination, her way of carrying the family name into places none of us could have ever dreamed. Everyone clapped, cousins whistled, uncles patted her back as though they'd coached her every step of the way, and my mother dabbed her eyes with a cocktail napkin as if Rachel had single-handedly saved the family from ruin. I sat at the end of the picnic table with a plate of ribs cooling in front of me, my name never once mentioned, and in that silence I felt myself disappear. They didn't pause, not once, to acknowledge the years I had scraped by on my own, or the fact that I had built something steady and mine without ever leaning on the safety nets they happily strung under Rachel. I heard my cousin Mark chuckle, loud enough for everyone to enjoy, about how some people just aren't built for big moves, and his eyes flicked toward me before he raised his beer. The table laughed politely, and no one defended me, not even Rachel, who leaned back in her chair with that satisfied smile, the kind that doesn't need words because it already says, "This is my show and you're just an extra." I tried chewing slowly, hoping the rhythm of biting and swallowing would steady the knot in my stomach, but it didn't. Instead, I caught myself remembering every family gathering over the years where I'd been the invisible one, birthdays where my gifts were set aside while Rachel's cards got read aloud. Holidays where my stories about work died halfway out of my mouth because someone decided Rachel's promotion, Rachel's bonus, Rachel's vacation photo deserved the spotlight more. It wasn't anger that brewed inside me that afternoon. It was something heavier, something like a quiet confirmation that my family had been writing me out of the script for years, and this barbecue was simply the latest draft. I watched my father gesture toward Rachel with his glass, watched my mother beam as if Rachel's reflection were her own, and felt the laughter sting my ears in a way I couldn't shake. I tried to breathe, tried to remind myself that I didn't come here for recognition or applause, but that mantra collapsed the moment Rachel looked across the table, caught my eye, and tilted her glass as though to toast me, except she didn't say my name. She never had to. That smirk of hers was enough to remind me that she knew exactly where she stood and where I did not. So I cleared the plates. One by one, I gathered the greasy bones, the crumpled napkins, the half-eaten corn cobs, as if I were auditioning for the role of household help instead of family. No one stopped me. In fact, my aunt even chuckled. See, she's always so helpful, and the others nodded, content to let me fade into the background while Rachel continued glowing in their applause. Each clink of a plate against another was a drumbeat in my chest, and I realized, somewhere between scraping a pile of sauce-soaked ribs into the trash and rinsing out the plastic cups, that this night would not dissolve into memory the way the others had. I carried the weight of those plates as if they were proof of my invisibility, and yet, in that silence, I began to feel something different bubbling beneath the humiliation. I wasn't going to give them a scene, wasn't going to storm out or hurl accusations across the lawn, because that would only give them another story where I played the bitter, jealous sibling. No, this time I was going to let their laughter echo until it grew thin, until it no longer rang with joy but with something else, something uneasy. By the time the last cousin dragged his chair across the grass and the citronella candles sputtered in their jars, I had already made up my mind. I smiled politely when Rachel waved goodbye, even hugged my mother when she pressed leftovers into my hands, but inside I carried a different kind of promise. I had let them forget me too many times, had swallowed too many moments of silence that tasted like shame, and this barbecue was going to be the last one they erased me from without consequence. When I closed my car door and sat in the stillness of the night, the muffled hum of the party drifting behind me, I knew I wouldn't need to raise my voice to be heard. I wouldn't need a scene, or a fight, or some desperate cry for recognition. The revenge I had in mind would be sharper, quieter, more unsettling. And as I turned the key in the ignition, I whispered to myself words I hadn't dared speak before. This time, I won't let it slide. I drove home with the windows down, the air thick with the scent of smoke and beer and overcooked meat, and every mile that passed only sharpened my certainty. By the time I pulled into my driveway, my phone buzzed with the first of what would be many messages, and I smiled to myself in the glow of the screen. I hadn't said a word at that table, hadn't given them even a glance of anger, but later that night, I would make sure my silence became the loudest voice in the room. The drive home should have been a rinse cycle for my head, a long hum that shook the barbecue smoke out of my hair and the pitying smiles out of my skin, yet the road unspooled like tape from an old answering machine. Each mile playing back a different message I'd saved without realizing it, the ones where my mother, in that soft, patient tone she used for church bake sales and insurance adjusters, told me to be gracious, because Rachel was carrying a lot on her plate, and the ones where my father, half joking and half sermonizing, reminded me that in this family we applaud results, not effort. Which would have been funny if I hadn't been the person collecting plates like a hotel busser while the star attraction dropped one-liners, as if applause were oxygen. I caught my reflection in the side window at a red light and had to laugh, not the hysterical kind, but the dry sort that comes when you realize the punchline was printed on your forehead the whole time, because somewhere along the way I had accepted the role of the helpful daughter, polite, self-sustaining, conveniently low maintenance, and now the costume itched and the zipper was jammed. By the time I parked, the neighborhood had gone quiet in that specific suburban way where lawns still smell like fertilizer and someone's dryer clicks somewhere behind a fence, and as I stood in my kitchen with the Tupperware my mother insisted I take, beans swimming in their own nostalgia, cornbread already collapsing into polite crumbs, I found myself doing inventory on the smaller humiliations, the dull ones that don't even register as pain until they've stacked high enough to block your view. The Christmas when Rachel got a new watch and I got a cookbook for singles, the graduation where my father introduced her to his colleagues and introduced me to the coat rack, the spring I paid my own car insurance while my parents co-signed her condo because interest rates are a once-in-a-generation opportunity, all of it a collage of almost compliments and logistics dressed as love. I let the faucet run because the sound steadied me, and while I watched the water swirl I realized I didn't want a dramatic confrontation that would turn me into the villain of their favorite family anecdote. I wanted something cleaner, a correction of the record that would read as inevitable once seen, like ink finally meeting paper it was always meant to find. I wish I could say the idea came like a lightning strike or a divine whisper, but the truth is embarrassingly practical, because I knew my parents' habits the way you know the creak in your own hallway, and I knew that in Dad's oak desk, the one he treated like a museum exhibit, there were folders labeled with the kind of enthusiasm reserved for the past: Grandma's estate, education, charitable giving, and the sacred family archive, each one stuffed with paper that told a story they never expected anyone to read aloud. I also knew their house better than I knew most apartments I'd rented, knew the angle of the study door that made it look closed from the hall while still catching a breeze, knew the quirk of the bottom drawer that stuck unless you tugged it like a stubborn dog on a leash, knew the security code to the alarm because I set it for them the winter they went to Florida and forgot how to disable the chime. In other words, I knew I didn't need a fight when I had access. Returning was simple because everyone assumes the helper came back to collect a sweater or a dish, and the porch still smelled like charcoal and citronella when I slipped in with the key that had never been taken from my keychain. And the house had that after-party hush where furniture seems hungover and the sink sulks under a film of sauce. I moved through the dark like someone who belonged there, switching on the study lamp my father favored, the one that made the leather chair look like it had stories. And I opened the sacred drawers with the patience of a librarian who understands that messy truth can be cataloged if you breathe through it. There they were, exactly where I expected, the will from my grandmother that said, in unmuddied handwriting, that her education fund was to be divided equally between her granddaughters, along with the accountant's neat annotations showing how the balance had been transferred to cover Rachel's graduate program with a line item described as temporary reallocation, and a second memo that reframed that reallocation as permanent once my career path did not materialize in a way warranting similar investment, which is a very polished way to say we decided the quiet one wouldn't need it. I kept turning pages and found the scholarship brochure with my mother's proud face smiling beside a line about supporting young women in business, a program named in honor of my grandmother and dedicated to excellence and initiative, which would have warmed me if not for the attached speech draft with my mother's notes in the margins where she'd crossed out the line mentioning both our daughters showing us different forms of success and replaced it with, "Our daughter Rachel teaches us daily." A revision so small it could have been a typo if it hadn't been the whole point. And, tucked into the family archive the way you file a menu you plan to order from again, I found a printout of Rachel's first condo mortgage with my parents' signatures on the cosigner line, a photocopied smile of approval that my father once called just paperwork, even though paperwork has a way of deciding the temperature of a room without ever raising its voice. I didn't feel rage. If anything, I felt a steadiness I hadn't expected as I photographed what I needed, not to plaster anywhere obvious or bludgeon anyone into apology, because I didn't want to win a messy trial in the court of group chat opinion. I wanted my family to discover a mirror and look up without knowing who placed it. And, because the universe occasionally assists the patient, I remembered the shared family cloud album my father adored, the one he treated like a hall of framed triumphs. A digital mantle where every birthday candle and work award lived forever with a caption that sounded like a campaign slogan. There is a feature, for those who curate their legacies like bonsai trees, that allows new albums to auto-share to the whole subscriber list with a gentle chime and a feel-good subject line. And while I am not typically a saboteur, I am tidy. And tidy people do their housekeeping with clean hands and metadata. I named the album BBQ Highlights because sometimes honesty is camouflage, and I slipped the photos into a sequence that felt natural. Rachel mid-toast with her perfect smile and Dad's glass raised, Mom's watery eyes beside a plate of ribs, cousins pretending to box with corn cobs, and then, like postcards tucked into a scrapbook by an aunt with poor sense of boundaries, the scanned page of the will with the equal division sentence as crisp as Sunday scripture. The accompanist memo where equal became expedient, the mortgage page with signatures that had always been no big deal, the scholarship draft where both became one, followed again by something harmless, kids chasing bubbles across the grass, the grill spitting tiny sparks that died before meeting the air, the family dog asleep under the folding chair as if none of us were awake. I didn't change a single caption because you don't need to shout when a sentence already reads like a verdict, and I set the album to share now, the sort of now that slips into phones at odd hours and asks nothing more strenuous than a tap. The chime went out into the night, a polite bell on a digital door, and I turned off the study lamp with the tenderness you reserve for finishing a chapter you know you will not reread, locked the door behind me, and walked back to my car without a single stolen thing in my pocket, besides the knowledge that revelation, when packaged like a family photo, does not feel like an attack until the viewer recognizes their own handwriting. My phone vibrated before I reached the end of the driveway, first a ping from the family group thread where my uncle typed a single thoughtful ellipsis, then another from my aunt who always leads with compliment before question. Then a third from a cousin who never reads attachments yet somehow understood the air had changed, and I allowed myself one small, indecently satisfied smile, the kind you hide behind a hand when the theater goes dark. The album was live, the captions were neutral, and for once I hadn't needed a speech to be heard. Somewhere in the house I had just left, a familiar phone would light up with friendly confetti and a cheerful subject line, and I pictured my mother's face as she swiped through the night we had all just lived and found, nestled between smoke and celebration. The paperwork that remembered me even when she did not. Morning came without ceremony, sunlight spilling across my blinds in a way that usually felt harmless, yet this time the light seemed to pry, as if the world had been up all night waiting for me to wake and face what I had done. I brewed coffee with hands steadier than I expected, listening to the familiar gurgle of the machine, and for a moment I entertained the idea that nothing significant had happened, that the barbecue had ended in laughter, that I had collected plates and gone home and slept without dreams. But then my phone buzzed on the counter, and the subject line of the first message reminded me that silence is rarely permanent when you've broken something as carefully maintained as a family narrative. The group chat, which usually resembled a patchwork quilt of birthday reminders, casserole recipes, and grainy photos of grandchildren, now pulsed with the unease of people trying to discuss a storm while pretending the sky was only a shade darker than usual. My uncle typed that the album was confusing, which was his polite way of saying he had scrolled too far and seen too much. My aunt replied with a soft defense of my parents, suggesting perhaps I had misunderstood the meaning of the documents, as though handwriting in black ink were a trick of the light, or as though temporary reallocation were a poetic flourish that meant something other than theft dressed in formality. Rachel, true to form, had not spoken in the thread at all, but I noticed her absence like a missing chair at the table, obvious, intentional, and weighted. I left the messages unread long enough to finish my coffee, savoring the bitter warmth as though it might fortify me for the inevitable ringing of the phone. It did not take long. My sister's name appeared across the screen with the urgency of someone who never wastes time dialing unless she plans to win the argument before the other person has even inhaled. I answered with a calmness that surprised me, my voice even, while hers burst through in a controlled fury that cracked around the edges. "What the hell did you think you were doing?" she asked, though the question had less to do with curiosity and more with the kind of disbelief people reserve for things they assumed were impossible. I let her words settle before I answered, reminding her that the documents were not mine to create, that the ink was not mine to spill, that all I had done was place the truth where everyone could see it. The same way our parents had placed her achievements on pedestals while leaving mine in the shadows. She hissed that I had embarrassed the family, that Mom was crying so hard she could barely speak, that Dad had locked himself in his study like a general retreating from a lost battle. And I almost laughed because for once their suffering was not born of my supposed failures, but of their own careful edits unraveling in the glare of daylight. Rachel tried to negotiate then, her voice slipping from rage to persuasion, reminding me that family reputations are delicate, that mistakes can be forgiven if kept private, that nothing good could come from dirty laundry waved on a digital clothesline. I listened politely, imagining the expression on her face as she paced whatever immaculate living room she currently occupied, probably with a coffee mug monogrammed with her initials. And I wondered if she understood that her persuasion only hardened my resolve. For years I had been asked to keep the peace, to swallow indignities, to accept invisibility in exchange for the appearance of harmony, and for once I had chosen not to. When she asked me to take it down, her tone shifting toward command, I told her simply that the album wasn't mine anymore once it landed in everyone's phones, that the truth doesn't retreat just because someone closes their eyes, and that if Mom was crying then perhaps she was grieving not the exposure, but the realization that favoritism has consequences beyond warm feelings and polite applause. Rachel's silence on the other end stretched long enough that I could hear her breath quicken, and I imagined her recalibrating, searching for a way to turn the story back to her advantage. Eventually she muttered that I would regret this, that families don't forgive betrayal, and I reminded her that betrayal requires loyalty in the first place, which had never been afforded equally in our house. After the call ended, I sat with the quiet that followed, not triumphant, but strangely level, as though the air in my apartment had settled into a new gravity. I checked the group chat again and saw no new messages, only the residue of confusion and defense, the digital silence that often follows a bombshell when no one wants to be the first to step into the smoke. It occurred to me then that revenge, if you could even call it that, was less about the satisfaction of striking back and more about the shifting of weight, the rebalancing of a scale that had been tilted so long everyone assumed crooked was normal. I spent the rest of the day moving deliberately through ordinary tasks, laundry, emails, dishes, because the steadiness of routine anchored me against the flood of what-ifs. What if they cut me off entirely? What if Rachel managed to spin the story back on me? What if Mom's tears turned into illness, into blame, into estrangement that could never be patched? Yet beneath the fear, a quieter thought persisted. What if this was the first time in decades that they were forced to see me not as an accessory to Rachel's glow, but as a force of my own, capable of forcing reflection in ways their praise never could? As night settled again and the hum of the refrigerator filled the pauses between my thoughts, my phone buzzed once more with a message from Rachel, stripped of all her earlier bravado, just 6 words that landed heavier than any threat. Mom hasn't stopped crying all day. I stared at the screen, not with guilt, but with the awareness that tears, like smoke, means something is burning, and sometimes what burns needs to be reduced to ash before anyone notices the spark. The afternoon sagged into that heavy quiet that houses take on after a storm has moved through without quite deciding whether to circle back, and I stood at my kitchen counter with the album still open on my phone, scrolling past my own careful sequence, as if I were a stranger who had stumbled into a family museum and found, behind the smiling exhibits, a storage room of mislabeled boxes that explained everything without needing to shout. And while I watched the little blue checkmarks line up, beside the names of aunts and cousins and the neighbor who somehow landed in our shared list because he once fixed my father's fence, I realized that the real panic would not come from what people had seen, but from the sudden understanding that the story they had repeated for years no longer fit like a favorite sweater and might never feel comfortable again. My voicemail stacked up as though the day were laying bricks. My mother's first message, a watery appeal layered with the kind of guilt that passes for intimacy in families like ours, my father's a curt pronouncement about context and interpretation and the impropriety of airing private matters, an aunt's whispered plea to be the mediator who could get us all to the table if only I would show a little grace, and, slipping between them like a needle, the accountant's calm voice returning a call I had not yet made because the documents, once seen, had already dialed on my behalf. I listened to none of them to the end, not out of cruelty, but because I knew each would try to use the same tools that had always worked: gentle shame, reasonable tone, the suggestion that I had overreacted, and I needed, for once, to move without their voices in my head. So I opened my laptop and drafted a message to the man whose name appeared on the original will my grandmother had signed with hands steadier than my mother's ever were, a lawyer who liked paper more than performance, and I asked in the politest, driest language I could manage whether the phrase, to be divided equally between my granddaughters, admitted the kind of temporary reallocation that later becomes permanent when one granddaughter fails to thrill, and whether the co-signing of a mortgage with education funds in a year that conveniently overlapped with graduate tuition could ever be construed as an investment in excellence if the other granddaughter received a cookbook and a lecture on bootstrap philosophy. I attached scans with the restraint of a surgeon who knows that drama does not improve an incision, and I pressed send without adding any flourish, because the only thing I wanted was light, and light, poured into the right place, does the work for you. While the cursor blinked, a small, relentless metronome, I considered the second front that had been sitting there for years in plain sight under the banner of philanthropy. The scholarship my mother adored because it let her rehearse a version of herself she believed in, the brochure where she posed like a sponsor of other women's dreams while a tidy little edit had already clipped the wings off mine, and I wrote another email, this time to the community foundation that handled the paperwork, the matching funds, and, most importantly, the ethics, and I added a note that said the materials used in the last 2 award cycles included language that did not reflect donor intent as recorded in the original documents, and that the promotional speech had been revised in a way that might mislead applicants into believing the program honored a fair standard when the practice at home suggested otherwise. I did not accuse. I did not threaten. I simply asked whether governance standards required a review when a donor representative used the program to amplify one beneficiary while quietly diverting designated funds from another, and whether they preferred to conduct that review quietly before the autumn gala or wait until the gala made silence impractical. The reply from the foundation came back faster than I expected, a crisp note from a compliance director who had no stake in my family's mythology and who thanked me for bringing a potential misalignment to their attention, adding that they would initiate a standard review, request supporting documentation from the donor's representatives, and temporarily pause promotional materials until clarifications were made, which, translated into our family's dialect, meant that the podium my mother loved would be standing before a dimmed room, the microphone live, but the teleprompter blank, and the applause delayed until someone produced more than slogans. Almost on top of that message, The law firm responded with a measured acknowledgement that the estate documents contained clear equalization language and that any temporary reallocations, unaccompanied by a contemporaneous reimbursement plan or written consent from both beneficiaries, might raise questions under the fiduciary standard, and if I wished to pursue it, they would be available to schedule a conversation about options, including but not limited to an accounting and a mediated family resolution, words that landed in my chest with the cold steadiness of a carpenter's level. It would be a lie to say my hands did not tremble then, because the theoretical had acquired a docket number and a calendar week, and while I sat there thinking of my grandmother's handwriting, the neat patience of the loops and the decisive bar of each crossed letter, my phone lit with Rachel's name again, followed by a text that tried very hard to sound casual and almost succeeded until the last clause, where she asked whether I was really going to drag strangers into a family misunderstanding, and whether I understood that Mom's heart was not strong, and whether I could just come over and talk like adults without emailing people who would force my parents to explain things that didn't need explaining. And I considered, for a long clean minute, the particular genius of making consequences sound like cruelty while calling the earlier theft a misunderstanding, and I typed back that adults sign documents precisely so explanations are not needed later, and that clarity is not an attack but an antiseptic, and that I would be delighted to come over when there was someone in the room who could say out loud, with the same conviction they reserve for toasts, that equal means equal even when no one is clapping. The group thread, sluggish and stunned all morning, revived in a sudden burst as the foundation's pause became visible, the gala page temporarily unavailable, the registration link returning a polite error, a cousin asking if the event was cancelled and an aunt suggesting it was probably just a tech hiccup, until someone noticed the update banner that read "Materials under review," at which point silence flooded back with the force of a door slamming, and I pictured my mother at her kitchen table staring at a screen that had always obeyed her, measuring whether she could afford to call me, whether the voice she would hear would sound like her daughter or like the mirror she had avoided. Late evening pulled the color out of the sky until the block looked like an old photograph, and I was folding laundry with a care that had nothing to do with cotton and everything to do with feeling steady when a car door thudded outside, heavier than any neighbor's, followed by a knock that was not the tentative tap of a package courier, and for a moment I watched the doorknob as if it might announce its intentions. I let the knock repeat, each time more certain of itself, and I took my time crossing the room, because haste is a cousin of apology, and I had no apologies left. Then I opened the door to find Rachel on the mat with the kind of face you get when you have been cast in a role you do not understand, and behind her, idling at the curb like a thought someone didn't want to finish. My parents' car with my father's outline gripping the steering wheel as if he could keep the whole evening from moving forward by refusing to release it. I stepped back and gestured into the living room, and as Rachel walked past me with a breath that sounded like a challenge barely held together by perfume, my phone vibrated in my pocket with a new email whose preview line read, with devastating bureaucratic calm, "We have opened a file and scheduled your initial consultation," and I smiled without joy because the room had finally filled with people who would have to choose between the story they preferred and the truth sitting on the coffee table like an uninvited guest who brought the guest list. Rachel sat stiffly on the edge of my sofa, her back straight as if she believed posture could somehow transform desperation into authority, while my parents lingered in the hallway, neither willing to cross the threshold first, both of them carrying the air of people who have been caught rehearsing a story that no longer makes sense once the lights come up. My father finally stepped forward, his hand still trembling slightly from the steering wheel he had gripped too hard on the way over, and he started talking in the voice he once used at board meetings, a deep, commanding register meant to smother dissent before it reached the surface, insisting that what I had unearthed was never intended to wound me, that adjustments had been made only to secure Rachel's future because the timing of her opportunities demanded urgency, and that I had been expected, with my so-called independence, to find my own way without constant intervention. He spoke in long, winding sentences that sought to Bury the core fact under layers of justification, but every word felt like furniture rearranged in a burning house, polished but irrelevant. My mother followed, her voice trembling in that practiced way that always won sympathy from strangers, telling me that she had only wanted to celebrate one daughter in public because she believed the other did not need the spotlight. That my strength and resilience had convinced her I would not crave the same attention, and that any omissions in speeches or brochures were not intended as erasures, but as misunderstandings born from assumptions about what I could endure. Her words should have moved me, perhaps once they might have, yet now they landed with the weight of a resignation letter typed too late, because I could still hear the careful edits in her voice, the choice to reframe deliberate actions as accidents of perception. And I understood that no apology would ever arrive without being dragged into the room by force. Rachel, meanwhile, fidgeted with her phone, her usual confidence splintered into a nervous energy that betrayed how deeply she feared the collapse of the narrative she had thrived on for decades. When she finally spoke, her words were brittle, accusing me of betrayal, of airing family matters in ways that strangers could now dissect, of humiliating her by suggesting that her success had been built not only on her own talent, but also on resources quietly siphoned from the well I was told had run dry. She asked if I hated her, and though the question sounded raw, it was not guilt that made her ask, but fear that the applause she had grown accustomed to would now carry an undertone of doubt. I listened to all three of them with the patience of someone who has spent years learning how to survive by holding her tongue, but when the silence finally opened wide enough for me to step into, I told them calmly that I had not manufactured a single word of what had been seen, that the ink was theirs, the signatures theirs, the edits theirs, and that I had merely arranged them in a sequence where they could no longer pretend the story was something else. I said that I had no interest in erasing Rachel's achievements, that her deal closing and her polished career were real enough to stand without stolen scaffolding, but that if those accomplishments required burying me in silence, then they were never as sturdy as they looked. My father's jaw clenched, my mother's eyes glossed, and Rachel's fingers froze on her screen, yet none of them offered contradiction, because truth does not require embellishment and silence is often the loudest agreement. The rest of the evening passed in a strained negotiation that never reached resolution. They wanted me to retract, to soften, to allow explanations that would sound plausible at church gatherings and community fundraisers, but I refused to undo what had already been done, telling them that the truth had been delivered not to destroy them, but to remind them that invisibility comes at a cost, and I was finished paying it. When they finally left, their departure carried no slamming doors or shouted threats, only the hollow quiet of people who have been forced to recognize that the rules they wrote no longer command obedience. Later, when the house returned to its familiar stillness, my phone lit with one more message from Rachel, just a single sentence sent at nearly midnight. "Mom hasn't stopped crying, and Dad says this will break us." I stared at it for a long time, not because I doubted its sincerity, but because I understood its purpose, a final attempt to fold guilt back into my chest and smother the steadiness I had finally claimed. I typed no reply. I set the phone face down on the table and let the silence spread across the room, heavy but clean. Knowing they would wake tomorrow, still trying to decide whether I had rescued the family from its own illusions or delivered the final blow that would fracture it beyond repair. What lingered was not triumph, but a deeper, sharper awareness, the knowledge that I had forced them to see me even if it came through tears and recrimination, and that sometimes the cruelest revenge is not a scream or a blow, but the simple act of refusing to vanish. They had wanted me invisible, but now they would carry the memory of this night into every gathering, every toast, every photograph, and though I might still sit at the table in silence, they would never again mistake that silence for absence. Whether that made me victor or villain, I no longer cared, because the only certainty I had as the clock pushed past midnight was that they would never forget me again.